From the Columbia University Language Resource Center, this is Said and Done, the podcast about languages and the people who speak them. This is Said and Done. I'm Chris Kaiser, and joining me is Yuri Shevchuk, professor of Ukrainian language at Columbia University. In this interview, we'll discuss how he grew up speaking Surzhyk, which is a mixture of Russian and Ukrainian. We'll talk about how he later focused on studying and speaking Ukrainian during his time at the university before going on to teach both English and Ukrainian. We'll go into some of the ways in which the usage of the Ukrainian language has been shifting during Putin's incursion into Ukraine in spring 2022. Finally, we'll discuss Professor Shevchuk's Ukrainian-English collocation dictionary, whose first edition was published in 2021. We'll talk about some of the subtle ways in which his writing of this dictionary anticipated and foresaw the tragic events of the past month. Here's my interview with Professor Yuri Shevchuk. Professor Yuri Shevchuk, thank you so much for joining me today. We're so glad you're here. Today we're going to talk about Ukrainian language, Ukrainian culture, which is a topic that's very much in the news today. But I just want to kind of explore a little bit what your background is and then talk a little bit about some of the work that you've done as an instructor of Ukrainian language. So I guess really the first question is, can you talk a little bit about where you grew up and the languages that you spoke as you were growing up when you were a kid?
I was born in and grew up in northwestern Ukraine. It's the intersection of two kind of traditional cultural and dialectal areas. One is called Polisia, or the woodlands, which stretches throughout the entire length of Ukraine from west to from the Polish border and east to the Russian border. And this is an ancient area considered to be the cradle of all Slavs. And the western part of it is called Volhynia, or Volhynian in Ukrainian, and that's going from the Belarusian border in the north, some 350, 400 kilometers down south to another historical land of Ukraine called Galicia or Halichina. And I grew up speaking a language that is not registered in normal language list because it wasn't a language per se. It was a mixture of two languages, Ukrainian as the basis and with a lexical admixture of Russian, popularly referred to as Surzhyk. That's a language that is a product of Russification, of the intense kind of contact between Ukrainian and Russian that produces this kind of macaronic mixture of languages. Normally it is considered to be a social stigma of people poorly educated or rural. And so although at school we learned stuff, I went to Ukrainian language school, and we learned stuff in literary Ukrainian, but speaking it in a kind of informal setting was considered to be odd, and so you had to speak Surzhyk. I had to face the situation when I found myself in Kyiv, where I enrolled in the Taras Shevchenko State University of Kyiv, which at that time was considered to be the best in Ukraine and probably third best in the Soviet Union. And my language immediately was noticed by my fellow students, and they most of them started laughing at me as a kind of a yokel, and very often I was branded a Banderite. A Banderite is a Russian way of saying a Nazi, just because I did not speak Russian. And so to me, the dilemma was either to switch to Russian and join the majority and kind of ride on the social prestige and social capital that Russian offered, or do something that a tiny minority of people like myself would do, namely to educate myself speaking Ukrainian without the admixture of Russian, pure Ukrainian, but the Ukrainian that would sound at the same time very natural and colloquial. And so I opted for the latter. And I started listening to other people. I started seeking other Ukrainians who had a similar attitude to their language, and creating a kind of an environment for myself that would be conducive to that kind of a novel language acquisition. And I succeeded. It took me, I don't know, maybe half a year to shed all the Russian borrowings. I had to suffer through kind of mockery and bantering on the part of my close friends, because they couldn't take the fact or reconcile themselves to the fact that I would say tak instead of Russian da if I said yes, because nobody said tak, and it immediately marked you. But they learned to put up with it, and so the rest was history.
So when you decided to speak Ukrainian, when you decided to learn it and learn it in a very systematic way and use it in your day-to-day life at the university, how old were you when you did this? And you mentioned your relationships with your friends. Were they speaking Russian and you were speaking Ukrainian to them? How did that interaction play out?
I was 17, and up until that age, I was very much enamored with things Russian. I was very Russophile. I loved Russian literature. I didn't like Ukrainian literature. I loved Russian language. I spoke it fluently. And I loved Russian culture, art, and particularly cinema. And I even did something that proved to be scandalous. I published a Russian language newspaper in a Ukrainian language school, which caused some problems for me on the part of the headmaster, who summoned me and said, and I told him to his face that I don't want to speak or write in Ukrainian because it means I am a yokel, and who wants to be a yokel?
So this was a real reversal then?
It was a real reversal, because when they started laughing at me just for being Ukrainian and for speaking this kind of mixture of Russian and Ukrainian, it had the effect opposite to intended. I asked myself, can it really be true that being Ukrainian is tantamount to being an idiot? And so I started kind of rediscovering Ukrainian culture. I started seeking out people who knew about Ukrainian literature and culture, and I discovered Ukrainian history. And so to me, it was something that probably every rebellious youth seeks, a kind of an act of self-assertion and rebellion against the rest of the world that was so easily available to me. I didn't have to quarrel with my parents the way others do. I just I had my own, started my own war with the Soviet Russian Empire that was everywhere. And I very quickly found that I was not alone, that there were many other people who were brainwashed like I had been. And I kind of felt this invisible front fighting back, and it gave us all an incredible sense of thrill and of being unlike the rest of the mob, or the rest of the faceless and conformist mob, which was incredibly wonderful for a young person of that age, a feeling.
So learning Ukrainian was really a kind of act of self-fashioning, both on an individual level, but as part of a collective as well. Is that how you feel about it?
Exactly so, yes. And again, as always, language is not just language. It's a gateway to the world of a respective culture. And so to me, regaining my language meant rediscovering, opening, and getting to know my own culture better, and starting this kind of fascinating journey of the entire life.
So you felt that you were really connecting with something that belonged to you, that belonged to your roots, and perhaps had not been available to you as you were growing up.
That is right. And also, I felt that I had to deconstruct and rip to pieces some inherited attitudes that kind of conditioned our self-perception, the self-perception of Ukrainians like myself and of my generation. And one of those attitudes was that being Ukrainian meant being provincial and only peasant-like. And I was a student of English. I learned English, and the very combination of English and Ukrainian was destroying those stereotypes, because speaking Ukrainian as your mother tongue and being able to, or being conversant with British and American literature, being able to quote from memory prose and poetry, English poetry, who could laugh at you as a yokel? Not any longer. And I realized that English was of great help for me, but also I tried to kind of demonstrate this symbiosis of two cultures to young people surrounding me, particularly when I started teaching English after I graduated from the university.
And so as you were graduating, you said that you were teaching English immediately after you graduated. Can you sort of talk a little bit about, what period of time was this? What was the political situation? What context were you doing this in?
This was the kind of peak of the Perestroika period, when I started teaching already at a provincial university in the city of Rivne. In Ukraine, the Perestroika was barely felt because the Ukrainian Communist Party was one of the most conservative holdouts of the old Soviet Communist Party. So, it really, I started teaching in 1987, but the things really started falling apart in Ukraine in 1989. And
Right.
and I taught English to students of who are irrigation engineers, and they were very resentful of the fact that they had to learn English, because they would keep telling me, "Are we expected to speak English to cows or to
Right.
tractors?" Because the Iron Curtain was largely still there,
Right.
so it wasn't easy to travel abroad. So English seemed like a completely useless proposition, and I insisted on them doing that. And I also try to organize some cultural events, like we had a theater, and we staged something based on Byron's poetry and other things. And so it was, I tried to find a way to students through literature, through poetry, and the poetry translated into Ukrainian, because their English was nowhere near enough to read poetry in the original.
Yeah. And so in this period, in the 89, 90, 91, 92, can you sort of talk through, were you teaching that whole time in Ukraine? Were you teaching English that whole time?
Yes, I taught English before coming to the United States from 87 to 92, but I also, trying to kind of do something about the Soviet Union, I started translating subversive texts, knowing that they wouldn't be published at that time. It would be suicidal, but it gave me a sense of doing something, of not putting up with what's going on. So I translated Animal Farm by George Orwell
Wow.
into Ukrainian. not even knowing at that time that Ukrainian was the first language Animal Farm had ever been translated.
Oh, okay.
And George Orwell himself wrote an introduction to the Ukrainian translation of Animal Farm. I did that in 1987, and then in 1989, I met the first translator of Animal Farm, Professor Yuri Shevchuk of Harvard University.
Wow.
So it was a very interesting meeting.
Yeah. So can you talk about your transition from teaching English in Ukraine to teaching Ukrainian in North America? How did that process take place?
It was something of a feat, and in 1989, for the first time, I traveled to the United States to visit friends, and other friends of mine told me that you must absolutely come to Harvard and meet people at the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, which I did, and it was a day when there was a big kind of party. There was to say farewell to some associate at the institute, and so everybody important was there, and I could meet everybody, all professors, and I spoke with a lot of people. I was a bit of a curiosity, a living Soviet.
Yeah.
Everybody wanted to talk with me,
Right.
to touch me, to like feel me or something. I don't know. and literally the third day of my stay there, they offered me to teach Ukrainian at Harvard Summer School. They said,
wow.
I speak beautiful Ukrainian, and they wanted me to teach, and I said, no, I can't teach. I mean, I can speak Ukrainian. I have no clue how to teach it.
Yeah.
I can teach English. I feel very much at home in my element. I can explain anything, why things are the way they are in English, but not in Ukrainian. And then the answer I got was very convincing to me, who knew that teaching Ukrainian as foreign language simply did not exist as specialization, as a major in the Soviet Union, because the presupposition was that it's a dying language, and no sane person would want to invest into learning it because it was a language without a future.
Right.
And so I was told by the director of the summer school, but somebody has to start. If we were to make Ukrainian internationally available, and that did it. I thought I want to be that person.
Right.
I didn't have the right visa, so I couldn't start teaching immediately. But I came back in 1990, and I started teaching Ukrainian. It was endlessly scary. I had to anticipate all kinds of questions on the part of my students, the answer to which mostly I didn't know, because my knowledge of Ukrainian was intuitive. So even the most simple thing I couldn't understand. That meant that I taught it like 24/7. I either learned about it, asked around, read literature, and prepared myself. And I told my students, I can't answer this question now, but I promise you I will tomorrow.
Right.
And so there were no, all the books published here, there were no textbooks, usable textbooks published in Ukraine for teaching Ukrainian as a foreign language. There were some published here, but they were dated and very boring. they were so boring. So what I did was create my own materials on the go,
Yeah.
which meant that every night I would go to bed at 1 in the morning and then be up at 6 to start my class at 8:20, and the class was for 4 hours. No, so it's an intensive course, five times a week. But things were improving with every year. I already knew what I had to prepare for the next summer. And so that's how I became a specialist in Ukrainian as foreign language.
So I wanted to ask a little bit about Ukrainian and, how does it fit into the larger picture of Slavic languages? How do these different Slavic languages relate to each other, and where is Ukrainian within that?
I never studied Slavic philology, so I don't feel strong or even entitled to touch upon it. So to me, that question has a very practical dimension of how Ukrainian relates in so many ways, grammatically, phonetically, syntactically, to languages that it's in immediate contact with. And in that sense, I'm well equipped because I know Russian fluently. I speak fluent Russian and I speak fluent Polish. Unfortunately, I don't speak fluent Belarusian. That's another Slavic language Ukrainian has been for ages in direct contact with. And ironically, the dialectal area I originate from is heavily influenced by Belarusian language. And so in our local argot, we use a lot of Belarusian words. And I realized that only when I started working with Belarusian texts, preparing my film course on Soviet and post-Soviet history, and not being able to find English texts about Belarusian cinema. So I started reading or trying to read Belarusian and discovered that I can read it quite fluently, and that all those words that were marking my people, my regional people, that they are actually from Belarusian, which is quite a thrilling discovery. If you, because I always have to deal with students coming from a Russian language background, almost every time, every year, in every group, sometimes even like 30% of my students are familiar or their first Slavic language was Russian. So I always take into account that profile, anticipating the challenges that they will have, because the knowledge of Russian is a double mixed blessing. In certain ways it helps, in many ways it doesn't. It's particularly, and that is directly related to a larger ideological question of whether or not Ukrainian is really a language, or as Russians like the rest of the world to believe, as just a southwestern dialect of Russian. And number one, Ukrainian and Russian are not mutually intelligible languages. The fact that Ukrainians, or all Ukrainians, understand Russian is not because they are intelligible, but because Ukrainians have been Russified. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the presence of Russian media in Ukraine have, up until recently, has diminished only so much. Lately, greatly. But up until 25 years, or like 5 years from now, even those who did not want to speak Russian or hear it were hard pressed to do so, because its ubiquity would make such a stance unfeasible. And so Russians, if you speak literary Ukrainian uncontaminated by Russians, would not understand you. And I know this from my own experience. I experimented on many occasions just for the fun of it, traveling to Moscow and sharing a compartment with a nice and polite Russian woman or man, and suddenly switching to Ukrainian. And literally, after 10 seconds, they would just give up and say, in a kind of devastated manner, "I'm terribly sorry, but I don't understand what you're saying."
Wow.
So let's put that falsehood to sleep or to bed. These languages are not mutually intelligible.
So what is, is there an analog, maybe like Spanish and Italian or something like that? What is the degree of distance between Russian and Ukrainian for somebody who would know one and not the other? Or are they just totally different?
They're not totally. It depends on how linguistically you are attuned. For instance, to some people, Portuguese and French are not mutually intelligible, or even Portuguese and Spanish. And to some people, they're perfectly intelligible. That depends on how attuned you are linguistically. I know that has to be a factor. Right. But generally, the kind of the parallel between Russian and Ukrainian in terms of mutual intelligibility is that of maybe Italian and Portuguese.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And because Portuguese and Spanish, I believe, particularly if you understand certain regularities when that NL in intervocal position in Portuguese disappear and and persona becomes persoa, bona boa, then you can easily decode it. Or, for instance, if you know that the Spanish L in Portuguese become R, so blanca is branca, playa is praia, again, it's easy to decode it. But in Ukrainian, that fix takes you only that far.
Yeah.
For instance, Ukrainian in that sense is Italian to Spanish, where Russians have E, Ukrainians have E. Like in Italian, E is very often where E is in Spanish. So I tell my students, accusative of you in Ukrainian is tebe, and in Russian dative tobi, and Russian is tebe, and stuff like that.
Yeah.
The most Ukrainian has a number of very salient phonetic features that mark it away from Russian to such an extent that they prove to be very difficult to acquire for Russian speakers. And they're now in play during the war of aggression of Russia against Ukraine. For instance, I used to joke to my students, telling them, do you know how Ukrainians catch Russian spies? And of course they don't. And I say, well, they ask them to pronounce the word palenitsa. Palenitsa is a loaf of bread in Ukrainian.
Okay. Yeah.
And it features one peculiarity of Ukrainian, the sound ts in Ukrainian is palatalized. It's tsa. Russians cannot, for love or money, pronounce it softly. So they say palenitsa.
Yeah. Ukraine is a really large country. It's about the size of France and Spain put together. Is that right? Or is it even bigger than that?
Smaller, probably like Spain and Portugal. But there's no larger country in Europe, fully European,
Right.
that is Ukraine, larger than Ukraine.
So I wanted to ask, of all the people living in this relatively large country, it seems like there's not one. There are different language communities and different language practice communities. You grew up in a community that spoke Surzhyk, which is, I guess you would call it its own distinct language, or would it be considered a dialect? How would you characterize
It's not
it?
a language. It's a mixture of two, and it's only a spoken language.
Yeah.
There were attempts to write in Surzhyk, but only for comical effects.
Mm-hmm.
You wouldn't write seriously in Surzhyk. It's almost like declaring that I'm neither here nor there. Nobody wants to be viewed that way.
So the people who live in Ukraine, what percentage of the people who live in Ukraine speak just Ukrainian as opposed to some other language or some other way of speaking that is not the Ukrainian that you teach?
It's very difficult to ascertain that because people are keenly aware of how they are perceived. So people who in fact speak Surzhyk would say that they speak Ukrainian. And people who speak Russian for fear of being unpatriotic, particularly now, would say that they speak Ukrainian or their mother tongue is Ukrainian. So this is a very, I don't have an answer to that question.
Okay.
I would say that maybe a good 30% of Ukrainians in reality speak Surzhyk. Not because they want to speak it, but because up until recently, there were no ways for people to bring up their own progeny speaking correct Ukrainian. Why? Because the way Ukrainian public sphere and media were formatted was such that you will have to listen to hear both Ukrainian and Russian speaking within in one message within the stretch of 5 minutes. So there's this constant mixture of the two that precludes you from learning either correct Russian or correct Ukrainian. And it used to be a consistent policy. I wrote an article about that in Ukrainian that provoked a national discussion, which is called, deliberately I called it in a provocative way, linguistic schizophrenia, Quo Vadis Ukraine, with a Ukraine, where I analyzed how this kind of phenomena is very dangerous for language ecology in Ukraine, how it dooms Ukrainian to death, and Russian in Ukraine as well, but Russian has Russia as its final mainland. So in the final analysis, nothing threatens Russian, but for Ukrainian, it's a very serious situation. And so the situation now started being slowly rectified. When these formats, when one, for instance, there would be talk shows when one host speaks Russian and another Ukrainian, and people would be exposed, including children. So I had to deal with students coming from Ukraine to learn Ukrainian with me, and who spoke absolutely non-stop Surzhyk, and I didn't know how to disentangle one from the other. It was absolute agony. It's a very serious challenge that Ukraine is faced with now.
So if you're in Kiev and you're moving, say you're touring the city, before, and you would speak to a person to buy a bus ticket, or you'd speak to somebody to, go to a restaurant, what language would you use? What language would be spoken? Or maybe what mixture of languages would be spoken?
Well, that depends. I never speak anything but Ukrainian when I'm in Ukraine, whether it's Kiev, Odessa, or Kharkiv. As a matter of principle, I don't need to speak any other language in Ukraine. Ukrainian is the language of the country. But mostly people, a normal person would speak the language that does not provoke discomfort or a negative reaction towards him.
And what would that be?
Very often in heavily Russified parts of Ukraine, there would be mockery. Why do you insist on speaking Ukrainian? Why do you demonstratively speak Ukrainian? All kinds of things. But people, Ukrainians, generations of them, grow up kind of very carefully listening to their environment and deciding how to behave communicatively to preclude that kind of an aggression. So, for instance, if the default language in Russified areas of Ukraine, they would, as a default language, would use Russian, because that way they kind of strategize that there would be no aggression back in response. Even in areas that are traditionally Ukrainian, speaking Russian involves no aggressive reaction. In Lviv, you can speak Russian and no aggressive reaction would ensue. But not so, for instance, up until very recently. Now the situation is very quickly changing. Russian has come to symbolize the brutality, the barbarism, the barbarity of Russia and Russian aggression, because they are killing their own people they call their brothers, and people they supposedly are defending Russian speakers. They are now indiscriminately bombing Kharkiv, where Ukrainian can hardly be heard in the streets. It's all Russian. So this is an education, a very cruel education for those people. And there is a kind of a sea change when people say, I am from now on, I will, out of principle, never utter a Russian word. And up until today, I spoke Russian. It's my mother tongue. So for them, it's a matter of principle, of kind of their own kind of contribution into fighting for their dignity, not to speak Russian.
So let me kind of repeat back to you what I've understood, and if you disagree, let me know. It seems to me like many people in Ukraine have a kind of dial where they can dial up Russian, they can dial down Ukrainian, or they can dial up Ukrainian and dial down Russian. Is that kind of how you perceive it?
Yep.
Based on kind of the social circumstances in which they find themselves.
The history of the Ukrainian nation is such that they grow up almost with an inbuilt kind of radar for danger and the capacity to conform with the environment, to survive.
Yeah.
You can hate it, and you can hate Ukrainian as the most conforming, nation on earth, but you can also love it because if it were not for this, Ukrainian would have not been around any longer. If they were not prepared to kind of merge with the environment and not stand out.
It's interesting to me that you've described that there are some people who, as you said, consider themselves to be mother tongue Russian living in Ukraine, now speaking Ukrainian as of the last month. And, what Ukrainian are they speaking? Have they known it? Do they speak it really as a second language? How's that playing out?
That depends. For instance, there was a kind of attitude, I'll better speak good Russian than butchered Ukrainian. And that was a generally accepted attitude. And now it's changing. They say anything, even the most horribly butchered Ukrainian, is poetry to our ears than the most correct Russian. Don't kid yourself. You will never learn to speak Ukrainian without butchering it. So butcher it to your heart's pleasure, because otherwise you will never speak it. You will never learn it. And that's exactly what I say to my students here at Columbia. Check your shame at the door.
Yeah.
We are shamelessly butchering language. We embrace mistakes. Without mistakes, there is no learning a language, and that's the way to go. And don't forget the word excuse me or sorry. There's no apologizing for mistakes. Not in my classroom, because there's nothing to apologize.
Yeah.
It's just natural. And so now, these attitudes, this kind of language ideology is changing.
Yeah.
How you go about language, how you view language, and how far you are prepared to go to master it.
As it seems like the Ukrainian language right now is in a state of flux. It's changing. People are speaking Ukrainian who weren't speaking it before. So as you look ahead, what do you imagine will happen with the Ukrainian language? Do you imagine that more people will want to continue to speak it? How does it play out in the future in your mind?
Well, ironically, thanks to very cruel irony, Putin turned Ukrainian into this last refuge of security, even for the fact that Russians do not understand Ukrainian, the communications in Ukrainian, but also the sense when you speak Ukrainian, you feel psychologically that you are with your people. You are with your country. And even Russian speakers feel discomfort now. Without anybody telling them, they feel discomfort and a sense of betrayal that they speak Russian now.
Yeah.
And that's thanks to Russian aggression. In an ironic kind of way, Putin accelerates or accomplishes what many generations of Ukrainian cultural figures or presidents could not accomplish. Facilitate and speed up the formation of the Ukrainian nation, a political nation that embraces everybody who recognizes a certain set of values, and one of those values is the value of the Ukrainian language,
even if the speaking of that language is imperfect.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's only a matter of time. It's a transitional phase. Today imperfect, tomorrow perfect.
So you are a proponent of the language. You're an activist for the language. You've dedicated yourself to this language, your life to this language. And one avenue in which your cultural commitments have taken place is through the creation of a collocation dictionary in Ukrainian. What is a collocation dictionary, and why did you feel that it was important to create one?
From day one, my students at Harvard and then here at Columbia complained about there being no usable dictionary that they could use to learn Ukrainian. So that should be Ukrainian-English or English-Ukrainian. I always had that in mind as a kind of an obligation that I have, that something has to be done about it. Nothing much was done. And I decided that simple bilingual dictionary doesn't cut it. That it has to be the dictionary that teaches you how to speak, not simply what the word means, but you don't know how to use it, how to combine it with other words. So collocation dictionary is exactly the kind of dictionary that teaches you how to combine one word with the other into minimal two-member phrases, and then on three-member phrases, and finally sentences. And also, and that's very, very important, it teaches you how to create with language, how to appropriate a foreign language and treat it as if it's your own language, because you can create with it. You can go more on your own. You don't need an instructor to help you do that. So, for instance, instead of learning a new word, you immediately learn how that word combines with other words. So, for instance, having that dictionary in hand, I ask my students not to learn 10 new words on the topic of your favorite hobbies, but prepare for the discussion of these 10 words. And so the discussion next time starts with the question. The new word, let us say, is a car. So the question goes, what kind of car can there be? And then the play around, students take turns in saying the car can be new, the car can be old, the car can be Japanese, English, French, the car can be broken, the car can be popular, and on and on and on and on. And so the students, even at the elementary level, they see that they could go so far. They didn't expect themselves to kind of, I call this linguistic imagination. That dictionary kind of helps a student extend their imagining things about a particular concept using a particular language.
So each entry has multiple uses of that word and the other words that this word tends to be attached to.
Exactly. And also things that are very Ukrainian, that they are not found. For instance, the English grammar is completely indifferent to such situations when a book is on the table and I put the book on the table. You just say on the table in both cases. Not so in Ukrainian. In Ukrainian, these are two different situations. One is static location, the book is on the table, and another is direction of motion, of movement, because you put the book on the table, the book moves from you to the table. And so they govern two different cases. On is followed by a noun table. One is in the accusative case, and another one is in the locative case. And that dictionary teaches you to acquire that specifically Slavic vision, which is typical of Slavic languages.
Not many people have written a dictionary. This is a very rare thing to do. As you were doing this, what was the hardest word? What was the hardest single entry, if you can think of one, that you had to write, and why was it so difficult?
I can't think of one particular, but for instance, there was a group of entries that are called or labeled in the theory of translation non-equivalent items, which means that they name phenomena that are non-existent for a different language community. They are unimportant.
So what are some of these?
They are invisible. For instance, very simple ones. For instance, the English does not have one word for 24 hours. You either have to say 24 hours or day and night, or day meaning 24 hours. Ukrainian has that noun, which means 24 hours. Doba. Doba means day and night in one word. A simple thing, but it's important to understand. For instance, a very challenging one is the noun kum. Kum is a close friend, so close that you invite him to be your son's or daughter's godfather. And this is such an important concept for Ukrainian culture, kum. The kum is basically the godfather doesn't cut it. It's only part of that meaning, because godfather has a direct Ukrainian equivalent in one word, which is chresny. But kum is both a very close friend, sometimes closer than a brother. Then Ukrainian for nepotism is derived from kum.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Not from nepoto, right, but from kum. So somebody is your kum, and you trust your kum. So, for instance, how do you translate that? There's no way of translating it through one word. So the only way is transliterate it.
Yeah, because in English, the word friend is very generic. You know, a friend could be somebody I see once every 2 weeks and I just say hi. A friend could be somebody who's as so important to me that they could be my child's godfather or godmother. So it doesn't really distinguish. But I guess, you know, kum is a person who's, you know, so close that they're worthy of being the godparent to your child. That's fascinating.
So, and for there are many other such words that are part of Ukrainian culture, and specifically Ukrainian kind of national law or psychology. And I wanted to not avoid them, but to somehow treat them and make them available and more easily understandable for learners. So that's one group. I'm thinking of other. It's interesting. I have spoken about this dictionary on so many occasions, and nobody asked a question that is so obvious. which were, because I'm now going through it and preparing the second edition,
right?
And I'm going to come up with an answer for that for myself and for you.
So you started this project really. It seems quite a while ago, and it has come to fruition in the last year. You published this. Is that right? So as you look at this project and you look at the events of spring 2022 and what's happening in Ukraine right now, has that caused you to rethink about this project or to reflect on it in a different way, or for it to take on a different meaning than it had before, or perhaps there's a continuity there?
It's surprising because how my general kind of optic and intention how to present things was anticipatory of what would come now. I'm reading through entries like politics or Russification or other such things that are pertinent to the Russian aggression. And they are almost, they sound as if they were written now.
Wow.
Not then. Because to me it was only a matter of time for the Russian Empire to take its last stand and try to take the rest of the world together with it to the inferno of the past, because it would not collapse without a fight, without trying to provoke a third world war. So if you, I remember one of my friends in Kyiv wrote an introduction to the dictionary. There's an extensive introduction to the dictionary, and she said, "Oh, this is very anti-Russian," and I personally didn't take it as anti-Russian at all, because I simply discuss certain things that cannot be understood in the Ukrainian language outside the context of Russian policy of Russification and relentless assimilationist pressure on the Ukrainian language with the ultimate goal of eliminating it, of destroying it, of relegating it to the past, to history, because that was one single thing that prevented Russians from absorbing Ukrainians.
Was the separate language, the separate culture, the separate identity.
Exactly. The culture, you can verbalize the culture in any other language, the way Irish verbalize their culture in English. But language is such a citadel of your identity, such a kind of source of feeling special, and special in the best sense of the word, that as long as it exists, the conqueror can vanquish you militarily, but you will never disappear. That's why, to me, language is singularly important for Ukrainian identity. You cannot be Ukrainian without the Ukrainian language. That's as simple as that.
Well, Professor Yuri Shevchuk, thank you so much for speaking about this, especially during this horrible time. And I know we've talked about many different things, and I'm really glad that you were able to share your journey with Ukrainian and how you've learned it and you've spread its learning throughout everywhere you've gone.
Thank you for the invitation.